Hello everyone, it's your favorite West Virginia in space here, and it's another Spoonhead debunking video. It's sadly not the true magnum opus I wanted to make because I'm still waiting on certain parts for that to get done. But this issue kind of annoyed me so much that I had to talk about right now. So this will be kind of a short little video, specifically on his videos. Is kind of like twin videos of if democracy was a video game and the Rumble video attached to it, or at least linked with it, And mostly because he just got so much wrong, like actual information incorrect, or either probably through a misunderstanding, that as I just had to talk about because someone has to call this out. Like realistically, I'm kind of shocked I'm the only one doing it, really. Like I honestly thought someone else would have shown up by now. But anyway, let's get into it. You know the rules for when I do these kind of videos. I expect you to have watched the videos that I'm talking about beforehand in order to fully understand the context and make sure I'm not just talking random stuff out of nowhere. Luckily, these two videos of his are very short. Like I think it totally would take you less than 5 minutes to watch both of them. So just go there. I'll link it down below so we all know that I'm not just making stuff up. So in the first video we're covering today, if democracy was a video game, he opens by trying to make the metaphor that democracy is like a video game. We're trying to make an analogy. Now, okay, not a bad place to start. Now, he goes on this part where he says, you're born into it, you didn't get to choose it or make it, and this isn't really a criticism of a republic or a democracy, because pretty much any government, unless you have to be born during a revolutionary period, is going to be like this. This isn't really an effective criticism. It could just be easily used against monarchy, or communism, or fascism, or whatever ism or government style you don't personally like. It's just not an effective one. To get over to actual criticism, though, is that he goes on the point where you don't get to pick the characters you vote for. Now, this is a bit more of a complicated issue, as fundamentally in a republic, which is what we're actually talking about here, is that it's kind of a popularity context. You have to be popular with the people to get elected. Now, there's a lot of ways you can become popular. Most commonly today, it's through career politicians, which is probably not optimal, but it could be anything. For instance, you could have a super famous YouTuber who could theoretically become president if he met the other qualifications for the job. Now, heck, most people say when you've been taught that JFK would become, they said, why would an actor become president? It's surprisingly, it's more about can you get people's attention and can you convince people that you would make a good leader. That's the element of how democracy, a democratic republic works. This is, now to get to the next part where it says as you pick a character and you can try to control them with your controller, is that they slowly stop doing what you want to over time. Now, this is a bit interesting, and I think it comes from a misunderstanding of how a republic works. Now, this is nothing I want to go into, is that he keeps saying democracy, but a more accurate term for what he's describing, especially because he's usually using this term of, say, modern republics, is a democratic republic or a constitutional republic. There's a few different terms you can use, but the more important thing is that we're talking about republics here, not democracies. Republics are usually use democracies, but they fundamentally work differently. In a true democracy, everything comes down to a vote with the people. There is no representatives, there is no leaders, everything's down to a collective vote. This has many different problems and why it's generally not used anymore. Republics are different as you vote a representative/leader into certain positions to do the job under the law. This has a few differences, but the major one is that you technically aren't supposed to be directly controlling them. That's not fundamentally how this works. You don't vote on every single issue or deal with every single policy. You get someone else to do that for you who is their job and most fit for the job. At least that's the ideal. Obviously, life can get complicated, but this fundamental misunderstanding of how a republic works gets kind of into what I think some people have issues with. They don't fundamentally understand republics, so when they criticize it, they're not criticizing it effectively, if that makes sense. And then it moves on to the part where it says that you think your character's broken, so you switch out the neck broken character for who you think fixes, but then the broken control thing comes up. We've kind of went over that it doesn't work really. And then he makes a more interesting point where he says, if you find a character you do like, you have to switch them out later because of arbitrary term limits. Now, there is a long reason of why you do have this in the American style republics, to kind of keep power from accumulating in a small hand individual, keep rotating out, the hope is to keep keep the government lean and not authoritarian. However, it is theoretically possible you could have a democratic republic that just simply doesn't have a term limit. You simply vote every 4 or 5 or whatever years, and as long as you can keep popularity, you can keep getting voted. I don't necessarily prefer this system, but that would be a way to deal with that criticism. But I would say that's at least an issue you could have a discussion about of how good is it to keep one good leader around. Now, this is to kind of circumvent away from what I thought was a very good point he made, is to go into a really bad point he made, where he points out that the leaders have to follow certain rules and can't just, do whatever they want, and then tries to act like that's a bad thing. There are reasons rulers are supposed to have rules to them, because, once again, history has shown time and time again that if leaders do not have rules that things they can't do, they will abuse their power. Heck, even if you do give them hard rules of what they can't do, they will often abuse it anyway, but at least then at least it tends to curb that behavior, or at the very least give people a reason to stop them when someone starts breaking those rules. This is why the English eventually became a constitutional republic, is when the king stopped obeying the traditions that he was supposed to follow, and then decided, know what, we're going to have this on hard paper, so it's not just a he said, she said kind of thing. Instead, it's a hard law you have to follow. That's why America is a constitutional republic, is so the leaders and rulers have hard limits, or at least part of it, is that they have hard limits of why they do what they can and can't do, is to protect the rights, freedom of the individual, and to keep the government from turning tyrannical and becoming horrible. And once again, you can just look to Nazi Germany and the USSR to see what happens when your leaders don't have rules attached to them. And finally, to finish out this part of the video, he then says, and he uses all the points he made to try to say that democracy is cringe and gay, and overall, it's not a terribly convincing argument, because like I said, when you actually look at his arguments or add the proper context or realize that he's kind of misunderstanding things, you kind of see that the conclusion he makes doesn't make sense. It's not a good criticism of democracy. There are criticisms of democratic republics you can most certainly make, but most of these weren't good ones. They either stem from misunderstandings of the system, actually pretty much all of them were misunderstandings, or simply don't make sense at all. But now that part of our video is done, we can now move on to the next section on his Rumble video. Now, the next part, of course, we're covering his Rumble video, which is more so just him ranting at Americans in general. And the title of this video, conveniently, is what I really think about Americans. And to get into this, because there isn't as quite as many points to get in here, he's kind of hypocritical. He goes on about how, Americans have so much pride in their nation, and any kind of criticism they deflect. And granted, some Americans have a problem with taking criticism, although it's much smaller than Europeans tend to give us. But more broadly is that we have quite a lot of reasons to have pride in our nation. We've done quite a lot of impressive things for our relatively short history. And historically speaking, especially in more modern-ish history, it's quite common for people to have pride in a nation, to be happy that they are part of the nation they are in. This isn't unusual in history. In fact, this loathing that a lot of people have for the nation is quite new in recent history. If anything, Americans being so pride in their nation is more so the traditional stance, as opposed to many places in the world today. But even more broadly, it's actually kind of hypocritical for Spoonhead / Aristocratic Utensil to say this, because he has so much pride in his culture and his people and Europe and Western, what he thinks are Western values, and to the point way more than most Americans would give, because most Americans, if you ask them, would kind of be willing to admit that they give some nuance to their opinions of why they think they're the best, or at least, give the context or understand that we aren't perfect, while Spoonhead doesn't really do this for his thing, making him a bit of a hypocrite for pointing out Americans for having so much pride in their people, but not understanding why someone else would. And this gets into actually some lies, kind of he points out, trying to say that America has done nothing special by pointing out how England conquered the whole world, but this isn't actually true. England conquered about 1/3 of the planet, give or take, geographically speaking. And once again, they never ruled the entire world, and their empire kind of fell apart relatively quickly after they did get to this massive height. But even pointing out England as an example to counterpoint to why America's lame is kind of terrible, because America's birth was literally punching England and then winning their independence in a war that England lost. And this gets even worse when you remember the fact that England needed America to save them in World War I and especially World War II. So saying oh, America's so weak because England is rather terrible, when America has shown up England on multiple different occasions. And even more broadly, America has many accomplishments to its name. We're an absolutely massive nation that's basically the size of all of Europe, give or take. And this gets even worse when we've won many major wars against many of the greatest powers of the day. Remember, we won wars against Germany, Japan, England, like a lot of powers we've been able to win in straight military conflicts. So Americans have a lot of reasons to be prideful in their nation, to love this nation, and we're far from pathetic, whimpering empire. And also, he continues to do that doomer kind of thought that is that America is going to fall soon, because everyone apparently forgot context and seems to think that because every time something bad happens, it's going to be the end of civilization, even though civilizations collapse very, very rarely historically. It's actually quite rare. That's a whole video I can make in itself, actually, but that's a different issue. But overall, it's kind of just him just hating on Americans with very little solid evidence, and ironically, of exposing a bit of hypocrisy in him. However, this gets into a more interesting thing I realized when plotting out this video. Mainly, why do people like Spoonhead have such a burning hatred for America? Now, admittedly, when I say why do they, I don't, someone will say it, but like I've pointed out here, a lot of times they tend to be hypocritical or reasons that don't make sense. I'm talking about the underlying reasons, the reasons behind what they say it is, the true reasons, and I think I actually cracked it. Now, obviously, not all people are like this, but I think with Spoonhead and a lot of other people like him, like some of his fans, for example, I think what's really going on here is that they have such strict worldviews of what is and isn't true that upon seeing anything that contradicts it, the necessary requirement to be able to keep your worldview is to reject the reality in order to keep it going. This is something we kind of see with some communists, for example, how they will continue to deny how human nature works in order to keep their economic policies going. But why does America get the brunt of this? Well, I think it's helpful if we look at a more simple example. I've pointed out a few times in this channel and during debates with Spoonhead's fans that when you say that, for example, that Africans can't build civilizations, and then when you point out African civilizations like Egypt, Ethiopia, Carthage, etc., their first response is to try to somehow not count them or redefine definitions so it doesn't have to work. Now, if you were trying to make an argument that Europeans or European culture is better than other cultures, then that would be an argument you could probably make, or at least try to, with, we also accepting the reality of there being, say, obviously major kingdoms in Africa. But when your worldview is so narrow that you have to only accept your version of reality to such a stingent point that you kind of have to start denying it. So when you have, once again, to say this belief that only Europeans can build true nations, then you have to reject the reality that isn't the case, that nations like Egypt and Ethiopia exist. And a similar example happens with America, because with Spoonhead and his fans and those type of people, they believe that only European-style monarchies that are mostly, if not only run by white people, super authoritarian, strong gender rules and that kind of thing, are the only civilizations that can make truly strong nations. And then you have America that, although far from perfect in dealing with race relations, gender relations, kind of shoots their argument in the foot. America is the superpower, but it's not based around race. It's not exclusively, or ever was, an exclusively white nation, even if we didn't always treat other races well. It's historically, for a long time, had equal rights between the sexes, and historically has had always some of the better rights with women, which is kind of sad if you look at the early rights for women in America. It is a republic and never was a monarchy in its history after it broke away from England, and yet still managed to grow and become a massive world power. It does all these different things that the worldview of people like Spoonhead simply can't accept. So rather than try to rework their worldview to be something like, oh, well, yes, a nation like America can do great things, but it could be better if it followed these ideas, they must simply reject that America is a powerful nation or is a nation of importance. in simply to trying to deal and try to keep their reality, because rather than make a worldview consistent with how the world actually works or historical facts, it's an attempt to try to hide reality to keep it working, which is not in common at all with more extreme ideologies, because they have to often rewrite reality to make themselves seem correct. Now, this is not unique once again, and it's understandable because no one has a perfect understanding of the world, so any belief that any of us had will at some point run into contradictions with reality. The important part, though, is that when you do realize that your ideas are flawed, not to bury reality or try to redefine the world so you somehow can keep your flawed ideas, but to actually improve your ideas to better deal with reality. A great example of this can somewhat actually be the history of how America got its government. The founding fathers looked at all the different governments that came before them and took the best pieces from other ones to make something special. It took a lot from England, it took a lot from, say, the classical republics of Athens, it even took some from the Native Americans, especially the Iroquois tribal governments, of how to do things. It took all these different things together, see what worked, see what didn't, and use it to make a much more stable government. That's how anyone should try to have their ideals. Look at reality and then adapt accordingly. But overall, that's just my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below, and we'll show the comment section will be nice and civil. Don't bully anyone, be nice and fair to everyone, and I will see you all next time. Yeah. Hey, why don't you hit that sub button? You're gonna become a subscribble. Get to see my content quicker. Wouldn't that be nice? I bet so.